Job is a form of calculated and focused writing called wisdom literature. A modern analogy struck me, but I didn't know the name for it, so I did what we modern people do. I Googled it. Hey Google, what's the name for art that changes with the angle you view it?
Anamorphosis is a perspective technique used in art that changes the image depending on the viewing angle.
Thank you, Google gal. Boy, that voice sounded familiar. Well, anyway, let's take a look at some of this anamorphic art. The paintings of people aging are the most thought-provoking to me. In a few steps, you cover an entire lifespan. But imagine this. 3 people come into a gallery, and they don't care to walk much, so each of them views the painting from a single but a different angle. Have they really seen the painting? Well, yes, of course. Do they have a true interpretation of the painting? Well, possibly. Now imagine the 3 meet later and their conversation diminishes into a confusing, heated argument where each is convinced the other's just plain nuts. What do you mean you saw a painting of an old woman? It was a young girl. What do you mean it was a young girl? It was a woman in her mid-30s. No, it was an old lady. No one is actually mistaken per se, and everyone is absolutely convinced. The problem? They can be no agreement and yet stay true to what they saw. Why are things so hopelessly confused when there is an absolute truth? One simple reason: perspective. Just limited perspective. Wisdom literature, like Job, is anamorphic art for the soul. If you're going to understand what God is really saying here, you have to mentally take a walk and view from different angles. Let's take a look at our next chapters and see just how this works. Here are the highlights of Job 20 through 26.
Zophar's sermon on the wicked man. Therefore my anxious thoughts make me answer. I have heard the rebuke that reproaches me, and the spirit of my understanding causes me to answer. That the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment? This is the portion from God for a wicked man, the heritage appointed to him by God. Job's discourse on the wicked. Bear with me that I may speak, and after I've spoken, keep mocking. Why do the wicked live and become old, yes, become mighty in power? Their descendants are established with them in their sight. Their houses are safe from fear, neither is the rod of God upon them. They spend their days in wealth. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out? The sorrows God distributes in his anger? Another man dies in the bitterness of his soul, never having eaten with pleasure. They lie down alike in the dust, and worms cover them. How then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? Eliphaz accuses Job of wickedness. Is not your wickedness great, and your iniquity without end? For you have taken pledges from your brother for no reason, and stripped the naked of their clothing. You have not given the weary water to drink. You've sent widows away empty. Therefore snares are all around you, and sudden fear troubles you. If you return to the Almighty, you will be built up. Job proclaims God's righteous judgments. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I've kept his way and not turned aside. I've not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. Bildad, how can man be righteous? Dominion and fear belong to him. He makes peace in his high places. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not rise? How then can man be righteous before God? Job, man's frailty and God's majesty. How have you helped me, who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many? To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit came from you?
It's kind of an amazing thing. To me, it's a mind bender, is that I could actually come in here with an anamorphic painting, and I could set it here, and let's say instead of a lady, it was actually Jesus himself. And it showed him at different points in different ways. But I could put this here, and people on this side would be sure they know who Jesus is because they saw something. And people on this side would look, and they would see something different, and they'd be sure they knew what they were seeing, and the two sides couldn't agree even though it was the same Jesus. You know, it happens every Sunday in churches all over the world, is there'll be a message given, there'll be something from the Lord's Word, and people will be sure they heard it, and for some reason we're looking at it from one angle only. Perspective. This evening we're going to go into some of the finer details of what went on in these verses, because it's pretty amazing what is actually happening through these chapters. But this morning, one-point sermon. It's all about perspective. Just perspective. Because that's the power of this thing called wisdom literature. So what it does, it takes me, it puts us at one angle of the painting, and then it forces us to go and then look at it from another angle of the painting, and your perspective becomes broader as you're made to look at it from these different angles. And we started from, in the first chapters, the God's eye view. Lucky us, we got to go to heaven. And we listened to this conversation between God and Satan. We learned things that God was saying. God stated himself, this was an upright man. This was someone in whom he was pleased. This was somebody who hadn't done anything wrong. And so we had that perspective. And then we saw Satan doing what Satan does. What does Satan do? He's the great accuser. He accuses us before God in heaven. He accuses us in all kinds of ways. And he makes life miserable. All we have to do is give him a chance, and he'll make life pretty miserable. And God does what God does. He takes whatever is going on, and he uses even evil. It isn't that God is even greater than evil, which is true. It's that he even takes the evil one and he's part of the mix in this great plan unfolding. Nobody gets to work outside of the will of God. So we had this perspective where we got to see who Job was from heaven. Now we were taken out of that perspective. We were forced into another angle. Now we're back on earth. And now we're watching things from this side, and we see all these human beings who are rushing around, and we see what it's like down here on planet Sinful. And we see these fellows who are good religious guys, but they have their anamorphic view of God. They've seen Him from only one angle, and they're sure that they've got it all figured out. God is just. Yes, He is. Seen it from that angle. God hates evil. Yep. Seen it from that angle. God is powerful. Yep. Can see it from that angle. They're looking. And much like the Hebrew culture of their time, that's why this book was written in the first place, they see God from this powerful judging angle. And they have something they know is true. If you sin, you suffer. That is true. Sooner or later you will suffer. God will judge. That is true. But it was down to just this little formula made from this one angle. If you sin, you suffer. If you're suffering, you sinned. Period. That was it. That was their angle. So in this story, there's a few good men who are poster children, if you will, for this way of viewing faith. They're religiously astute, because if you want to know anything from this angle, they can tell you. They've got it all down. They're guys that if they went into the t-shirt business, by golly, we'd all come in here wearing their shirts and their quotes and be proud of it. Because they're right from their angle. But from their angle. And you know what? They're compassionate guys too in their way, because they've traveled a long way to see this suffering friend that needs their help. Just imagine if we only saw from that perspective. We'd say these guys are pretty good guys. And then there's this other guy, this Job guy. He's the guy, you're seeing him camped out under the overpass down there in Indy somewhere. He's the guy with a cardboard sign that says, "Lost everything, need help." And you know what? When you drive by, you glance over and you say, there's a fellow who's made a lot of bad decisions in life. That dude needs Jesus. We should go down and witness to him, because it's obvious that guy under the overpass needs Jesus. Must have done a lot of wrong things. Well, as we change our viewing angle, that's kind of where it leaves us. But we already know this, even from paintings, these perspective paintings they made, that perspective is a powerful thing, isn't it? So it must be quite an incredible stumbling block if you don't have it properly. Now let's go into a midway perspective, as you will. And I just want to do this. I'm going to read just the opening of the arguments as each of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, started speaking to Job. This is how they opened their conversations. Eliphaz was this way. Job 4, he says, "If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Now a word was secretly brought to me," this is Eliphaz, "and my ear received a whisper of it in disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night. Should a wise man answer with empty knowledge and fill himself with the east wind? Should he reason unprofitable talk, or by speeches by which he can do no good? I will tell you, hear me, what I have seen I will declare, what wise men have told." Bildad was much the same. In 8 he says, "How long will you speak these things, and the words of your mouth be like strong wind? How long till you put an end to those words? Gain understanding, and afterwards we will speak. Why are we counted as beasts and regarded stupid in your sight? And Zophar. In 11, should not the multitude of the words be answered, and should a man full of talk be vindicated? Therefore my anxious thoughts make me answer because of the turmoil within me. I have heard the rebuke that reproaches me, and the spirit of my understanding causes me to answer. Well, they're speaking in prose. That's not quite the way we speak here in Indiana, is it? But do you get an impression of what's going on here? What's the attitude of these fine gentlemen? I know the truth. And you need to stop talking and listen to me because you don't know the truth. I've got a perspective. I am convinced I know what I'm saying. And off they go and they speak, and they even have scriptural background that they can point to, all from the same angle. All from the one perspective. Perspective is a powerful thing. Aren't you glad that people aren't that way in church today? We don't have folks anymore who think they know it and boy, everybody else needs to hear what they're saying and that's the way it is. If we were in that position though, imagine this for us. What if we didn't have these other views that we could look at? What if we were in the story? Would we be any different than Bildad or Zophar? If we hadn't been allowed the perspective of being up in heaven and seeing where things are? Ancient Israel itself laments how they killed their own prophets. They saw it, Isaiah and 2, in a log. And later generations tried to turn a blind eye somewhat to it. Why did they do it? Well, people convinced and they had a perspective and they were sure that was the right way to go. Here's Job. He's this guy with the cardboard sign and the ugly rash sitting under the overpass. And boy, from our earthly perspective, we can see he's a mess. We should just dismiss that guy. But even if we only had the earthly perspective, maybe, you know that thing Chris was talking about in his video about humility and learning from it and a little bit of empathy? If we listen to this guy, we might hear a little gem every now and then that says, maybe it's not quite the case we thought it was. Maybe he's not suffering just because he's a sinful mess. Maybe God's doing something else with this man, and that's not the case at all. But we'd have to change our perspective a bit. Do we tend to do that? Well, not really, because we know we're right. We see an angle. We know it. Now let me reintroduce the first perspective in here, the one that wisdom literature placed us in the very beginning. The man with the cardboard sign and the ugly rash is actually blameless before God, and the only reason we know is because we were allowed to see from that perspective. He's not completely perfect, it's just that he is pleasing to God. Wow, I didn't see that from the overpass. Took another angle of view, didn't it? And those good men who were so sincere, once we look at the fact that they are looking at from only one perspective, if you sin, you suffer. If you suffer, you sin. They are taking poor old Job, this man who has done nothing wrong, and they are beating a square peg in a round hole, and it's a painful process. They're good people. They mean well. So how is it they're doing something so painful? How is it they're being so downright cruel? How is it that they're doing something they don't even mean to be doing? Because they are so convinced. Why are they so convinced? Because of their perspective. Well, everybody needs a perspective. Yeah, but when it's a limited perspective, you're in trouble. When you only know God from an angle this big, there's a whole lot of God you don't know. And you can do some bad stuff pushing from a limited perspective. Well, if it's such a bad thing, how do we avoid the trap? How do we do what the wisdom literature is actually trying to teach you, is that, you know what, this painting of God, you need to walk around and see this from a few angles or you're in trouble. Well, it's not the full answer, but let me give you a little bit of a nutshell on perspective. It's like this. It starts with the heart, it moves from the mind, and involves the will. Psalms 139:23 says, "Search me, O God, and know my..." Anybody care to finish that one? Hey, there we go. Psalms 26:2 says, "Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my mind and my heart." You see it all the time. You might even do it all the time. I know I can get caught in this if I'm not careful. There's a word from God, but if your heart isn't right to hear the word that's even true, but your heart's not right, it's kind of falls on that hard ground, that barren ground. You can even sit in here and nod and say, yeah, I read that somewhere in the scripture, and say, that's really cool, and go out, and it makes no difference to you at all. It bounces off like seeds on rocky ground. But if the heart's right, then at least you're in a position. Now you're ready to hear something. Now the perspective might change a little bit. Especially, we keep going on about how we want to hear God. What is it? I want to hear your voice. I want to hear your words, God, when He's already said so much. How about we start with the right heart listening to what God has already said, and then move into the will where we actually put it into practice. Here's the thing about this. You know what this is? Every now and then you run into someone who will say, wherever, whatever church, is a cliche, I'm not being fed. Well, if this is feeding, you're in trouble. You know what this is? This is the hors d'oeuvre. This is nothing more than an appetizer. Where the real feeding is when we come together and wrestle with things in the small groups, in the prayer groups, when we get together in each other's lives and we start applying what we read and what we're studying. That's where the real food is. This is just a way that is pointing you to where the kitchen is, I guess. So if we're not doing that, we're in trouble. I don't know. Maybe some of us have killer studies we do all by ourselves, but if that's true, invite the rest of us. We want to be in on it too. Imagine this. Imagine if someone created a masterpiece, and I'm waiting for this one, creates a masterpiece of anamorphic art, and they do this stunning capture of God Himself, where in this detail, when you change the angle, you're looking at this picture. From here, this angle, you see God the Savior, and from here you see the Comforter and the Teacher. And as you move over, you see the God who transforms those who are conformed. And as you keep on moving, you see the unstoppable Judge, and you see the perfectly just, and you see the almighty power, and you see the God who lifts up and can do things. But you have to walk around the whole picture to see all these angles. Makes me wonder if our faith were our feet. I wonder how many of us have actually walked around that painting a little bit, that anamorphic art. I wonder how broad each of us are in our perspective. You know why after 3,000 years plus you still have something called wisdom literature and scripture? Is because it says your perspective is that important. how broadly, how wide your viewing angle is of God. Because the perspective from which you view God, which you view the life in which He's put you, and the people who He has put in that circle of life, your perspective, depending on the width, will make a difference between actually knowing something God wants you to know, actually being wise, or just being someone you're convinced you know something when you really don't. Just a question. How wide is your perspective? How wide is your view of God?